Yeah, no, good question. I think first it's important to recall it's part of UNESCO, one of UNESCO's functions as a kind of observatory of societal change. We sometimes call it a laboratory of ideas function, but it's really an exercise and part of a tradition of UNESCO that at key moments of rapid societal change and transformation, that we're encouraged to kind of take our foot off the accelerator, to pause, to look at the bigger picture. What is the state of the world? Where have we come from? Where are we heading? And what does this mean for how we understand the purpose of education and the organization of learning opportunities? So this report is in that tradition, and UNESCO has done this at different key moments, if you want, uh, of um, of rapid change. It was first done in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a time of social and political turmoil. We had civil rights movements, the women's liberation movement, independence movements in the global south. It was a time of rapid growth. It was a time of the Cold War. Um, there was although we had two very different development models, both were firmly rooted in kind of belief in science and progress. Early 60s, sorry, late 60s, early 70s. This was obviously before the internet. So that was the first time we did this kind of exercise, and there were notions around learning to be, that education should be promoting uh, uh, learning to be, that education is not limited to a period in one's lifetime. So this was the initial idea of lifelong, what was called at the time, lifelong education. Um, the report at that time, the FOR report, spoke of the Learning Society. So this was the first exercise. The second time this was done was the early 90s. This was just after the end of the Cold War, a period of intensified globalization. It was the early days of the internet. Um, with the end of the Cold War was also a kind of dominant narrative around a more instrumental, liberal approach to development and to education, kind of reducing education to its economic and productive function. And that's why what is known as the Delors report that was published in 96 was really about recalling, and that's what people remember, the four pillars of education: learning to be, learning to do, learning to live together. And it was to recall both the individual and collective functions of education, both personal and societal, both in terms of personal development, spiritual, and also more material and productive. And perhaps what carried the furthest at the time was this idea of learning to live together. This was concerned at the time with social cohesion, at this time of globalization. So now this report came out, the Futures of Education report, second decade of the 21st century. We know that we had the adoption of the Sustainable Development Agenda in 2015, a recognition that our challenges are more interconnected and interdependent, a kind of growing awareness of the adverse impact of human activity on the natural environment, on our shared planet. Um, but I would say that despite the fact that we had the 2030 agenda, the impact of the climate crisis, for example, today, what we're seeing is that the impact is much worse than what scientists had predicted in 2015. Um, Inequalities, although they were flagged as being one of the main issues, we see that inequalities within practically all countries have been growing. We have seen more recently democratic backsliding and growing polarization of our societies. Freedom House just last year looked at the past 15 years, and every year of the past 15 years, the number of countries where freedoms were being restricted, the number of countries where freedoms were being restricted outnumbered each year the number of countries where there was progress in political freedoms. There's been, some would document an upsurge in violent conflict. The number of refugees in the world has grown. There's obviously the pace of technological innovation, in particular artificial intelligence, and our challenge to even keep up and understand the full implications and to regulate. Let me recall also that in the same year, the report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education came out. The Secretary General of the United Nations had released his report a few months earlier, Our Common Agenda. And there, the Secretary General spoke in terms of this turning point at which we find ourselves in global development, and framed it in terms of a choice between breakdown or breakthrough, a choice between continuing on an unsustainable path or radically changing course. And this is the same framing that we have in the Futures of Education report, understanding that the key to changing course is education, but it cannot be the same education. It's got to be a different education. And two main reasons for that. One is that despite the progress we've made over the decades in terms of national, international education development efforts, the promise of quality basic education for all, fulfilling the right to basic education for all, remains unrealized. We still have 250 million children, youth out of school. We still have 770 million youth and adults who are non-literate, and what could go on. So there's still an issue about exclusion from the basic right to education. And for this reason alone, we cannot continue doing more of the same in education. We need to fundamentally rethink our approaches and our models. So that's the first reason. And the second reason to be rethinking our education systems is obviously the unsustainable economic and social development patterns that we're seeing, which are really threatening our futures, the future of humanity and the future of the planet. And here, education is sometimes also part of the problem in promoting human exceptionalism, individualism, competition over cooperation. So for both of these reasons, it's like having one foot in the past and one foot in the future. The present of education needs a more fundamental rethink. It's not about doing more of what we're doing. It's about doing things differently. And this is what the invitation of the report on the futures of education is, really an invitation to contextualize that discussion and that questioning in the diversity of contexts. Let me perhaps start by saying that much of the discussions about the future of education, and we did quite substantive literature review back in 2019, it was before COVID, that a lot of it is about how education needs to adapt to changes, to wider changes. And I think the premise here is to say it's not only about education adapting to the changes around us. Most of the discussions will be around, there's technological innovation that's changing labor market, requirements. Education needs to adapt. Education systems are slow to adapt. That's the kind of dominant narrative. So rather than adapt, the report is speaking about how we need to rethink education so that it can shape more sustainable futures. And that's why futures is used in the plural. The idea that no trend is destiny, and that we need a different education that can take us in different directions, because much of what we see in our development patterns are unsustainable. And to do this, we need to do it together. We need the involvement of all, and that governments alone cannot solve the development challenges that we have, and we need to have everyone empowered and encouraged to participate in making the types of changes that we need. And so that's the idea of the social contract. It's obviously not in the conventional, traditional understanding of social contract, of a contract between state and citizen, but it's rather a more relational idea of the social contract. In other words, the need to bring in everyone, because education is really a shared responsibility and part of, you know, a societal project and a public endeavor. So one of the key principles for social contracts, so just to make that perhaps a little clearer, which is proposed, is to say that education, yes, it's a public good, but it is also a common good. So what does that mean? Basically, that when we speak of education as a common good, we're reaffirming the collective dimension of education. And it's true that much of the discussion, much of the more instrumental kind of discussions about education usually frame it as individual trajectories. So, you know, we need certain skill sets, we need 21st century skills and mobility of individuals. And yes, education is a personal trajectory, but it's also a public endeavor. It's also a societal project. And so when we speak of common good, the first aspect is that we are recalling the importance of the collective dimension of education. It is about education that serves public interests and that happens in public spaces. So that's the first kind of dimension, if you want, of the common good. Second is, when we speak of education as a common good, we underscore the need for stronger cooperation across a range of constituencies, and that cooperation must be based on the principle of solidarity, fundamental human rights. It's a shared responsibility, and we need public accountability. And perhaps lastly, when we say education as a common good, as a basic principle of this new social contract, then we're speaking of democratic participation. We need, if it is a collective public endeavor, we need inclusive processes of public policy formulation and implementation, obviously with due accountability. And so a renewed social contract for education, education as a common good, requires also new forms, mechanisms, institutions of participatory democracy. So I think this is really the main idea, that we need a different approach to education if we are to define a different education that can take us towards, you know, more just and sustainable futures. So we need to renew the social contract with a basic principle that on which it should be built, of education as a common good, this collective dimension, the shared responsibility, and the need for democratic space for democratic participation. So that's the key idea around the renewed social contract. The report then also has a number of proposals in terms of directions that we can go, in terms of pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity, in terms of curricular design and approaches to the knowledge commons, um, proposals, recommendations around collaborative teaching, around rethinking the space of the school, around better connecting learning spaces between formal and other social, professional, cultural spaces. Um, uh, so the key idea around the social contract, and then a set of recommendations and proposals to take forward and to contextualize in terms of how we organize learning and how we design educational experiences. Okay. I think first it's important to maybe be clear about the nature of this report and its purpose. It's not a blueprint. It's not meant to say, it's not a tool for what needs to be done and how that needs to be done. It is really an invitation for public debate, policy dialogue, innovation, research, and action to a range of constituencies to renew and education, to do things differently, to take us in these more sustainable directions. Again, we said earlier, it's not about doing more of the same, but about doing differently, and for that we need everyone's voice: researchers, teachers, school leaders, students, student organizations, civil society organizations, communities. So it is really an invitation. So that's important to say. So in terms of impact, it is a range of constituencies. I could start by saying, for one, that just in terms of the consultation and downloading of this report on the UNESCO website, just to start with that. In 2022, I mean, it was released very late 21. In 2022, it was every month, it was by far the most downloaded UNESCO knowledge product, if you want, and across all the areas of UNESCO work. I mean, knowledge products relative to education, culture, science, and all the areas that we work in. So I'm saying, and it continues to be among the top 5 today, still most consulted UNESCO publications online. That just indicates that there is a demand for this type of thing. There is a demand, as we said at the beginning, to step back, pause for a moment, and look at the bigger picture of where are we in terms of global development, where have we come from, where are we likely to go, where do we want to go, and what does this mean for education? So really, it's a first indication, I would say, of the demand for this type of publication, this type of thinking. Next is the fact that we have some over 16 languages, translation into some. We did the UN official languages. There are 6 of them: English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Russian. But there are many more languages, which indicate that there is a demand at particular levels in Europe. That includes Latvian, Slovenian, Portuguese. The Greek version is currently. These have been initiated because there's a perceived relevance and usefulness of engaging or responding to this invitation, which is the report, invitation for public debate, policy dialogue at all levels, to be looking at how we might innovate and do differently in education to shape a different future. So that's one indication. A second, at the international level, we had in 2022 the UN Secretary General convened the Transforming Education Summit. and the key reference that was proposed as a starting point for thinking about transforming education was this Futures of Education report. That's just in terms of, let's say, helping to frame the international global policy debate. So at that level, I would say, I mean, quite a bit of visibility. The degree to which the ideas permeated those discussions is another question, but it was perceived as being an important starting point in terms of the global education policy. We have also other more specific, in 2022 in particular, we had the World Conference on Higher Education. The report of the Commission was the main framing for that conference, the International Conference on Adult Education and Learning. Regional conferences in Southeast Asia and the Arab world have also referenced and used some of the framing of the report. So it has civil society organizations. I'm thinking the Global Campaign for Education and the 100+ NGOs engaged in education. So it has had that influence. In terms of research impact, we are in the process of monitoring more specifically, but there's been at least in English, and we haven't looked at other languages, there have been at least over the past 2 years some 200 articles published in reference to or about the report. So it is also, and that's part of the impact. Again, it's the idea is to speak to all constituencies and for all to contribute in their respective spaces. So researchers are engaging with this at the international policy level. In some country contexts, and I can take just a recent example because I've, in the context of Italy, just because I was there very recently, the report has been used to inform public policy discussions at different levels, and there's now very much aligned, I would say, with the thinking around the renewed social contract is the Italian specific experience of community educational pacts. So the idea of a much more inclusive and kind of participatory process of mobilizing a range of stakeholders around education at more of the community level. So we are in the process really of trying to monitor better, and it is at different levels that the impact, that's perhaps part of the challenge of such a report, that it is at the same time intended to influence the global policy discussions, as it is to inspire researchers, as it is to serve as a reference at national or local levels in terms of policy debate, or in other contexts has been, there have been cases of using this as part of teacher professional development, just engaging with these larger questions. So this is the process is open and ongoing. We know that change in education is both top down and bottom up. We need both. We need everyone involved, and the process continues, and that's also why we're organizing at the end of this year, 2024, International Forum on the Futures of Education. This will be in Korea, 2nd to the 4th of December. And the idea there is really to be able to share at policy level, practice at different levels in terms of research, experiences and insights from efforts to move in the direction outlined in the Futures of Education report.